December in Oregon carries the weight of rain and silence. In Medford, a town tucked against mountains in memory, two women disappeared on a Tuesday morning in 1995. Roxanne Ellis and Michelle Abdill left for work and never returned. When their truck was found days later, what lay inside changed everything. The crime scene spoke of calculation, duct tape, restraints, execution-style violence. For years, questions lingered in quiet rooms and unanswered vigils. Then a mother watched the evening news. She saw a sketch. She recognized her son. One phone call fractured the case wide open, leading investigators across state lines to another victim, another grave. What followed was not just an arrest, but a reckoning, a community forced to confront hatred hiding in plain sight. Some wounds close, some transform into something else entirely. This is the story of both. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The winter morning of December 4th arrived cold and clear over Medford, Oregon. Roxanne Ellis woke before dawn, as she always did, moving through the familiar rhythm of coffee and silence. At 53, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had built a life on reliability. Her partner, Michelle Abdill, stirred in the next room, already organizing the day's schedule in her mind. At 42, Michelle brought warmth to their property management business, balancing Roxy's steadiness with her own optimism. They dressed for work in practical layers. December meant cold site visits, properties to inspect, tenants to reassure. Their business planner sat open on the kitchen counter, pages marked with appointments. One entry stood out near the bottom, a new client inquiry, address listed, time confirmed. Neither woman thought much of it. New clients meant growth. Growth meant stability. Roxy poured a second cup of coffee while Michelle checked the truck. The white Chevy pickup sat in the driveway, canopy secured, tools rattling in the bed. Everything in order. A neighbor waved from across the street as they pulled away. The gesture was ordinary, forgettable. Later, it would be the last confirmed sighting. Downtown Medford hummed with pre-holiday energy. Storefronts displayed festive signs. People moved with purpose, arms full of shopping bags and errands. Roxy and Michelle navigated the familiar streets, discussing their route. First stop, a rental property near the edge of town. Second, the new client meeting. They expected to be home by evening. The business planner noted the final appointment without fanfare. Just an address, just a time, just another name on a list that would later be studied, dissected, and mourned. By afternoon, Ellis's truck had been spotted near a rental property on the south side of town. A tenant remembered seeing it parked outside, engine running briefly before pulling away. The sighting placed them on schedule, moving through their day as planned. But when evening came, neither woman answered phone calls. Michelle's phone rang unanswered in the truck. Roxy's remained silent. Family members tried repeatedly. Each call met with voicemail. At first, concern was muted. Car trouble, perhaps. A flat tire. A meeting running late. Medford was not a place where people vanished. But as darkness settled, unease grew. Roxy's daughter called friends, then colleagues, then anyone who might have seen them. No one had. The last confirmed contact had been mid-afternoon, a brief exchange about paperwork, nothing unusual. After that, silence. Michelle's relatives checked the office. Lights off. Doors locked. The planner still sat on the desk, open to December 4th. The final entry stared back. New client. Address circled. Appointment time underlined. It was meant to be routine. By 9 o'clock, the family's worry had crystallized into something sharper. They called the Medford Police Department. A missing person report was filed. 2 women. Business partners. Last seen driving a white Chevy pickup with a canopy. The dispatcher's tone was calm, professional. 48 hours, she said. Most people turn up. But the family knew something had gone wrong. Overnight, the absence became a presence. The house felt wrong without them. The office felt abandoned. Friends began calling each other, sharing fragments of information, piecing together a timeline that ended in emptiness. Where had they gone after the rental property? Who was the new client? Why hadn't they called? The questions multiplied. The answers did not. Night deepened over Medford. In homes across town, people who knew Roxy and Michelle made more calls. The police dispatcher logged each one, noting the growing alarm. By midnight, the missing person alert had been escalated. Patrol units were notified. A search grid was being prepared. Ellis's daughter could not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, replaying the day. Her mother never missed check-ins. Never. Michelle was the same, punctual, reliable, always reachable. Their silence was not carelessness. It was absence. At the police station, officers reviewed the initial report. 2 women in their 40s and 50s, property managers, known in the community, no history of disappearing, no signs of personal crisis. The facts pointed towards something external, something sudden. Neighbors near the last known rental property were questioned. One recalled seeing the white truck around 2 in the afternoon. Another remembered a man standing near it, tall, unfamiliar, pacing. The description was vague but persistent. The man had seemed nervous, out of place. He had not approached the truck directly, but had lingered nearby, watching. The detail was noted, filed, added to the growing list of fragments. Local radio picked up the story by morning. 2 missing businesswomen, last seen Tuesday afternoon. If anyone has information, please call. The announcement was brief, sandwiched between weather and traffic. But in a town like Medford, news traveled faster than broadcasts. By dawn, flyers were being printed. Roxy's face beside Michelle's. Partners in business and life. The word missing stamped across the top. Friends distributed them at grocery stores, gas stations, coffee shops. Every surface became a canvas for their faces. Fear moved quietly through the community. Not panic, not yet, but a creeping awareness that safety was not guaranteed. 2 women had driven to work and disappeared. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. December 5th brought investigators into full motion. Detectives canvassed the areas near the women's last confirmed location. The rental property yielded little, no signs of struggle, no disturbances. The tenant recalled the truck's brief appearance but offered no additional details. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses was collected. Gas station cameras captured Ellis's vehicle moving through town late that afternoon, heading east. The timestamp placed them an hour past their scheduled return. Receipts were pulled, cross-referenced, mapped. The trail suggested they had completed the rental property visit and proceeded to the final appointment. But where was that appointment? The planner listed an address, but when officers arrived, they found an empty lot. No structure, no business, just gravel and weeds. Either the address was wrong, or it had been deliberately falsified. Witnesses were re-interviewed. The man seen near the truck became a focal point. Tall, lean, dark jacket, nervous energy. One witness remembered him leaving the area on foot, heading toward the main road. Another recalled a vehicle, a sedan, color uncertain, parked a block away. The descriptions were compiled. A composite sketch was commissioned. The detective leading the case, a methodical man with 2 decades of experience, reviewed every detail twice. He believed in patterns. He believed in thoroughness. He believed that someone, somewhere, had seen something useful. Tension built within the investigative team. 48 hours had passed. The window for finding the women alive was narrowing. Searches expanded to wooded areas, back roads, abandoned buildings. Volunteers joined officers, walking grid patterns, calling out names that went unanswered. Ellis's daughter appeared on local television, voice steady despite exhaustion. She described her mother reliable, kind, devoted. She described Michelle warm, organized, beloved. She asked the community for help. Someone knew something. Someone had to. The response was immediate. Tips flooded the station. Most were well-meaning but vague. A few seemed credible. Investigators followed each one, methodically, knowing that one detail could change everything. By December 6th, the case had consumed the town. Flyers covered every public space. Roxy's face and Michelle's became ubiquitous, staring out from windows and bulletin boards. The images showed them together partners, not just co-workers. The distinction mattered. It spoke to who they were, how they lived, what they had built. Ellis's daughter held a vigil at the town square. Candles were lit. Prayers were spoken. Friends gathered in tight circles, sharing memories that felt both comforting and unbearable. Michelle's relatives stood nearby, silent, holding photographs. The community showed up. Medford was small enough that tragedy was collective. Meanwhile, investigators continued tracing the women's final hours. A receipt surfaced from a hardware store, dated December 3rd. The purchase: duct tape, heavy-duty industrial strength. The buyer: unknown. The clerk remembered the transaction vaguely: a man, paying cash, no conversation. The receipt had been found discarded near the empty lot address. The detail was chilling. Duct tape suggested restraint. Restraint suggested premeditation. This was not random violence. This was planned. Forensic teams analyzed the empty lot. Tire tracks were photographed, cataloged. Soil samples were taken. A small scrap of fabric was recovered from a chain-link fence, blue denim, consistent with work clothing. It was bagged, labeled, sent for analysis. The detective studied the evidence wall in the station. Photographs, maps, witness statements, receipts. The pieces were there, scattered, waiting to be assembled. He could feel the shape of the crime forming, but not yet the face of the criminal. Roxy's daughter could not stop moving. She distributed more flyers. She called more friends. She refused to consider the worst. Her mother was out there. Michelle was out there. They would come home. But the hours stretched into days, and hope began to fracture. By nightfall, The vigil candles burned low. People drifted home, haunted by the silence of unanswered questions. December 7th began with a call to the police station. A cable installer, working a routine service route, had spotted a white Chevy pickup in a commercial parking lot. The vehicle matched the description circulated in the missing person alert. The canopy was closed. The truck appeared abandoned. Officers arrived within minutes. The parking lot was empty, except for the pickup. No signs of activity. No signs of the women. The detective approached cautiously, noting the vehicle's position backed into a corner space. Canopy latch shut. He knocked on the canopy. No response. He tried the latch, locked from inside. A decision was made. The canopy was pried open. Inside, the truth waited. Roxanne Ellis and Michelle Abdil lay bound and gagged, their bodies draped with fabric, their faces covered. Duct tape wrapped their wrists and ankles. Both had been shot in the head, execution style. The scene spoke of control, calculation, and cruelty. Boxes had been placed over their bodies, a crude attempt to conceal them or prepare them for transport. The detective stepped back, his composure intact but his mind racing. This was murder, premeditated, methodical. The killer had taken time to restrain them, to position them, to hide them. He had not acted in panic. He had acted with intent. The parking lot was sealed. Crime scene investigators descended. Photographs were taken from every angle. Evidence was collected. Duct tape fragments, bullet casings, fibers, prints. The truck's interior was processed meticulously. Address labels were found scattered near the bodies. White stickers, printed, adhesive backing intact. They bore no names, just numbers and streets. The labels were bagged, cataloged, and sent for analysis. Word spread through Medford within hours. The vigil transformed into mourning. Candles were relit, this time not in hope but in grief. Ellis's daughter collapsed into the arms of friends. Michelle's family stood silent, unable to process the enormity of loss. The town stopped. Businesses closed early. Schools held moments of silence. Fear and sorrow intertwined, inseparable. By December 8th, the investigation had shifted from search to pursuit. The detective coordinated with forensic teams, witness coordinators, and media liaisons. A composite sketch was finalized based on witness descriptions: the tall man seen near the truck, the nervous figure pacing near the empty lot. The sketch was released to local television stations. Media coverage intensified. The Medford double homicide dominated headlines. Reporters descended on the town, cameras capturing the vigil sites, the parking lot, the grieving families. The story was no longer local. It was regional, then statewide. The sketch aired during the evening news. A grainy black and white image, angular face, hollow eyes, unkempt hair. The anchor's voice was measured. If you recognize this individual, please contact the Medford Police Department immediately. All tips will be kept confidential. The switchboard lit up. Dozens of calls poured in. Some offered names, some offered theories. Most were well-intentioned, but unhelpful. Investigators sifted through each one, separating credible leads from speculation. One witness recalled seeing the man near a gas station on December 4th, early evening. Another remembered him at a diner, alone, agitated. The sightings placed him in Medford during the critical hours, but they did not yet provide a name. The detective reviewed the address labels found in the truck. The forensic report confirmed they were mass-produced, available at any office supply store. But the printing was distinct, specific fonts, specific spacing. Someone had created these labels for a purpose. The labels became the key. If they could trace their origin, they could trace the killer. Leads continued to flood in through the night. The detective did not sleep. He studied the sketch, the evidence, the timeline. Somewhere in the chaos of information was the connection he needed. Somewhere was the name that would break the case open. And then, on the morning of December 9th, the phone rang again. The voice on the line was hesitant, trembling. A woman, middle-aged, calling from a number outside Medford. She had seen the sketch on television. She recognized the face. It was her son. The detective listened. His pen paused over the notepad. The woman spoke slowly, each word weighted with disbelief and heartbreak. She provided his name, Robert James Ackerman. She described his recent instability, his transient lifestyle, his angry outbursts. She had not seen him in weeks. She did not know where he was, but she knew the face in the sketch. It was him. The detective asked about the address labels. The woman hesitated. Then she explained. She had recently moved. Ackerman had helped her pack. She had used printed address labels to organize her boxes. He would have had access to them. Officers were dispatched to her home. The labels were collected, photographed, compared. The match was undeniable. The fonts, the spacing, the adhesive identical to those found in the truck with the Drock victims. The woman's courage turned speculation into proof. Her son was now the primary suspect. Within hours, the case expanded. Investigators contacted California authorities. Ackerman had ties to Stockton. He had been seen there recently. More troubling, a missing person report from October matched his timeline. Scott George, a young man, had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Witnesses placed Ackerman near George's last known location. The detective coordinated with California officers. Evidence was shared. Timelines were cross-referenced. A pattern emerged. Ackerman moved between states, leaving violence in his wake. The media seized on the development. Headlines shifted. Mother identifies son in Medford murders. The community reacted with shock and grief, not just for the victims, but for the mother forced to choose between love and justice. Her phone call had changed everything. The case was no longer a mystery. It was a manhunt. December 10th brought coordination between Oregon and California law enforcement. The detective contacted his counterparts in Stockton, sharing Ackerman's description, his known aliases, his vehicle information. Scott George's case file was pulled. The missing man had last been seen in late October, near an area Ackerman frequented. Receipts told the story. Gas station transactions, convenience store purchases, all placing Ackerman in both Oregon and California during the critical periods. His movements traced a disturbing arc across state lines. He was not stationary, he was hunting. Witnesses in Stockton recalled seeing Ackerman in the days following George's disappearance. He had been agitated, evasive, moving between motels. One clerk remembered him paying cash, refusing to provide identification. Another recalled a nervous energy, a reluctance to make eye contact. The detective in Medford felt the case tightening. Ackerman was no longer an abstraction. He was real, traceable, close. The challenge now was location. Where had he gone after Medford? Where was he hiding? Surveillance footage from California businesses was reviewed. Ackerman appeared in grainy video, walking through a parking lot, entering a store, exiting quickly. The timestamps placed him in Stockton as recently as December 9th, one day after the sketch aired. California officers mobilized. Units were dispatched to known motels, boarding houses, transient camps. Informants were contacted. The search widened. Meanwhile, forensic analysis continued in Oregon. Ballistics confirmed that the bullets recovered from Ellis and Abdil matched a common caliber, likely from a semi-automatic handgun. Fingerprints lifted from the truck's interior were processed. One partial matched records on file Ackerman's from a prior arrest years earlier. The evidence was mounting. Address label, receipts, fingerprints, witness identifications. The case was no longer circumstantial, it was concrete. Ellis's daughter received updates from the detective. Each piece of news brought relief and anguish. Relief that progress was being made, anguish that it could not undo what had been done. December 12th marked the culmination of the manhunt. Surveillance teams in Stockton located Ackerman at a rundown motel on the city's outskirts. He was seen entering a room alone, carrying a duffel bag. Officers surrounded the building, securing exits, coordinating entry. The confrontation was brief. When officers knocked, Ackerman opened the door. He was armed but did not resist. The weapon, a semi-automatic handgun, was secured immediately. He was placed in custody without incident, his expression vacant, detached. Inside the motel room, evidence was everywhere. Receipts from Oregon and California, clothing stained with dirt and unidentified substances, a notebook filled with fragmented writings, paranoid, disjointed, occasionally violent. The writings referenced targets, failures, and necessary actions. The language was coded, disturbing. The motel clerk was interviewed. She identified Ackerman from the composite sketch broadcast on Oregon News. She had seen him coming and going at odd hours, always alone, always tense. She had thought about calling police but had hesitated. Now, she wished she had acted sooner. Ackerman was transported to the Stockton Police Department. California officers began questioning him about Scott George. Oregon detectives arrived by evening, ready to address the Medford murders. The interrogation rooms were prepared. Evidence was organized. The case against him was overwhelming. But before questions began, something unexpected occurred. Ackerman spoke first. He wanted to talk. He wanted to confess. The detective from Medford sat across from him, recorder running, witness present. Ackerman's voice was flat, emotionless. He described the murders in clinical detail. He admitted planning to rob Ellis and Abdil. He admitted restraining them. He admitted executing them. He claimed robbery as the motive, but his language betrayed something deeper: contempt, resentment, hatred. When asked about Scott George, Ackerman did not hesitate. He confessed to that murder as well. He offered to show them where the body was hidden. The room fell silent. Justice had arrived swiftly, but it carried no satisfaction. December 13th began with Ackerman's formal arrest. Charges were filed in both Oregon and California: aggravated murder, kidnapping, robbery. The evidence was cataloged, photographed, and prepared for prosecution. Ballistics confirmed the handgun recovered from the motel matched the bullets that killed Ellis and Abdil. Fingerprints from the truck matched Ackerman's. The duct tape bore fibers consistent with materials found in his possession, but it was the confession that sealed the case. Recorded, witnessed, and detailed, Ackerman's admission left no room for doubt. He described the timeline: meeting the women under the pretense of a property inquiry, overpowering them with a weapon, restraining them with duct tape, driving them to the parking lot, and executing them. He admitted placing boxes over their bodies, intending to transport them later but abandoning the plan when fear overtook him. The detective pressed him on motive. Ackerman's answers were evasive at first, focused on robbery, but as the interrogation continued, his language shifted. He mentioned disgust. He mentioned judgment. He admitted hatred for lesbians, though he framed it as incidental rather than central. The detective knew better. The choice of victims was not random. Later that day, Ackerman led California officers to a remote mine shaft outside Stockton. Scott George's remains were recovered skeletal, partially decomposed, wrapped in fabric. The cause of death was consistent with gunshot trauma. Ackerman described the murder with the same detachment he had shown in Oregon. George had been a target of opportunity. Robbery, again, was the stated motive. But the pattern was undeniable. Media coverage exploded. The story was no longer regional, it was national. Killer driven by hate became the headline. Advocacy groups called for the case to be prosecuted as a hate crime. The LGBTQ+ community in Medford and beyond demanded recognition of the bias underlying the violence. Ellis's daughter watched the coverage from home, numb. Justice was moving forward, but it felt hollow. Her mother was gone. Michelle was gone. No arrest could change that. The mine shaft recovery marked the midpoint of the narrative, a moment where all trajectories converged. Ackerman's confession expanded the case beyond Medford, revealing a campaign of violence that crossed state lines and targeted vulnerable individuals. The revelation reframed the tragedy as part of a broader pattern, one rooted in prejudice, opportunism, and rage. In Medford, the community struggled to process the news. Vigils continued, but their tone shifted. Grief remained, but anger grew. How had Ackerman moved so freely? How had he chosen his victims with such calculated cruelty? The questions had no comforting answers. Ellis's daughter and Michelle's family met with the detective. He walked them through the evidence, the timeline, the confession. He answered their questions with honesty and care. He could not undo their loss, but he could offer them clarity. They left the meeting exhausted, grateful, and heartbroken. Meanwhile, the prosecutor reviewed the case file. The evidence was overwhelming. Confession, forensics, witness testimony all pointed to guilt. The decision was made to pursue the death penalty. Aggravated murder with kidnapping met the legal threshold. The case would proceed to trial. Defense attorneys were appointed. Their task was unenviable: defend a confessed killer whose actions defied explanation. They reviewed psychiatric evaluations, searching for mitigating factors. Ackerman's history revealed instability, delusional thinking, and a fragmented sense of reality. The defense would argue diminished capacity, though they knew the odds were slim. The legal machinery moved forward. Arraignment was scheduled. Plea negotiations were attempted and rejected. The case would go before a jury. The community watched, waiting for the process to deliver what it promised: justice. But justice, as the families knew, was not restoration. It was accountability. It was consequence. It was a line drawn between right and wrong. It could not bring Roxy and Michelle back. It could only ensure their deaths were not forgotten. Early in the new year, preparations for trial consumed the prosecutor's office. Evidence was organized into exhibits. Witnesses were interviewed and prepared for testimony. Forensic experts reviewed their findings, ready to present ballistics, fingerprints, and DNA analysis. The case against Ackerman was airtight, but the prosecutor left nothing to chance. The defense attorney faced an uphill battle. His client had confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. The only viable strategy was to challenge Ackerman's mental state at the time of the crimes. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered. Doctors interviewed Ackerman over weeks, probing his thought patterns, his emotional responses, his grasp of reality. The evaluations revealed a man detached from consequence. Ackerman demonstrated delusional tendencies, paranoid beliefs, distorted reasoning, an inability to process the moral weight of his actions. But he also demonstrated awareness. He knew right from wrong. He understood the law. The delusions did not absolve him. The defense attorney argued for leniency based on diminished capacity. He framed Akrament as a man whose mind had fractured, whose actions were driven by illness rather than intent. The argument was legally sound but emotionally hollow. The family saw through it. The community rejected it. Meanwhile, the forensic evidence continued to solidify. Duct tape recovered from the truck bore Akrament's fingerprints and fibers matching his clothing. The address labels were traced definitively to his mother's moving supplies. Ballistics confirmed the weapon found in his possession fired the bullets that killed Ellis, Abdil, and George. Every thread led back to him. Ellis's daughter met with the prosecutor. She wanted to understand the process, the timeline, the likely outcome. The prosecutor explained the penalty phase, how the jury would decide between life imprisonment and death. He did not sugarcoat the difficulty. Death penalty cases were long, exhausting, and emotionally draining, but he believed the evidence warranted it. She nodded, silent. She did not want vengeance. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted the world to know her mother's life had mattered. September 11th arrived with little fanfare. The courtroom was packed. Family members filled the front rows. Reporters lined the back. The judge entered, his demeanor measured, his voice calm. The proceedings began. Akrament sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys. His expression was blank, eyes unfocused. He showed no emotion as charges were read. 2 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, multiple counts of robbery. The litany of crimes filled the room, each one a wound reopened. The prosecutor stood. He addressed the court with precision, outlining the state's case. He described the victims: Roxanne Ellis, a devoted businesswoman and partner; Michelle Abdil, a community advocate and beloved friend. He detailed their final day, their final appointment, their final moments. He presented the evidence: duct tape, bullets, fingerprints, confession. Then came the plea. The judge asked Akrament how he wished to plead. Akrament's voice was quiet. Guilty. The word hung in the air. No trial. No prolonged legal battle. Just admission. The families exhaled, some in relief, others in disbelief. It was over before it had truly begun. But the plea did not end the process. The penalty phase loomed. The jury would now decide whether Akrament deserved life in prison or execution. The prosecutor prepared to argue for death. The defense attorney prepared to argue for mercy. Outside the courthouse, vigils formed. Activists called for the case to be recognized as a hate crime, though Oregon law did not provide that designation at the time. Signs read, "Justice for Roxy and Michelle." Candles flickered in the afternoon light. Ellis's daughter spoke to reporters. Her voice was steady. She said her mother would have wanted compassion, even now. But she also wanted accountability. The system had to respond. The community had to remember. Inside, the legal machinery continued. The penalty phase was scheduled. The waiting resumed. The penalty phase began in early spring. The courtroom filled again, the atmosphere heavier than before. This was no longer about guilt that had been established. This was about consequence, life or death. The jury held that power. The prosecutor opened with photographs. Roxy and Michelle, smiling, alive, full of purpose. Then came the crime scene images: bodies bound, faces covered, lives extinguished. The contrast was deliberate, devastating. He called forensic experts who described the bullets' trajectories, the restraint marks, the calculated nature of the execution. He called the medical examiner, who detailed the cause of death with clinical precision. Then came the emotional testimony. Ellis's daughter took the stand. She spoke of her mother's kindness, her dedication, her love. She described the void left behind, the holidays without her, the milestones unmarked. Her voice cracked only once, but she did not stop. She needed the jury to see her mother as human, not just a victim. Michelle's relatives followed. They spoke of her warmth, her volunteer work, her ability to make anyone feel seen. They spoke of the community she had built, the lives she had touched. Their grief was palpable. The defense attorney countered with psychiatric testimony. Doctors described Akrament's delusions, his fragmented thinking, his inability to process emotion. They argued that his mental state, while not absolving guilt, warranted mercy. Execution, they claimed, would punish illness rather than evil. The prosecutor responded sharply. Akrament knew what he was doing. He planned the crime. He restrained his victims. He executed them. Illness did not grant immunity from consequence. The jury deliberated for hours. Photographs lined the deliberation room. Evidence. Victims. The defendant's blank stare. They weighed mercy against justice, compassion against accountability. On October 27th, they returned. The verdict was read. Death. Ellis's daughter closed her eyes. Justice had arrived, but it felt like loss compounded. The verdict reverberated through Medford. Front-page headlines declared, "Justice for Roxy and Michelle." But the response was mixed. Some felt relief finally, accountability. Others questioned the death penalty's morality, its finality, its cost. Jurors spoke to reporters afterward, their faces drawn. They described the deliberation as the hardest decision they had ever made. They had reviewed every photograph, every testimony, every psychiatric report. They had weighed Ackerman's mental state against the brutality of his action. In the end, the premeditation, the restraints, the execution-style killings all pointed toward a level of control that negated claims of diminished capacity. One juror described the moment they examined the duct tape evidence, the careful wrapping, the deliberate placement. It spoke of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Another juror mentioned the victims, how their faces in photographs haunted the deliberation room. Roxy's steady gaze, Michelle's warm smile, lives cut short by calculated violence. Ellis's daughter released a statement thanking the jury for their service. She acknowledged the difficulty of their decision. She expressed gratitude for the legal system's diligence, but privately, she felt hollow. The verdict did not resurrect her mother. It did not undo the horror. It simply drew a line. This far, no further. The community held another vigil. This one felt different, less about mourning, more about closure. Speakers addressed the crowd, emphasizing resilience, remembrance, and the need to combat hatred in all its forms. The LGBTQ+ community spoke powerfully about visibility, safety, and the ongoing fight for recognition. Ackerman was transferred to Oregon State Penitentiary, where death row inmates awaited their fate. His expression remained vacant throughout the transport. Guards noted his detachment, his lack of emotional response. He moved through the system like a ghost, present but absent. The prosecutor met with the families one final time. He explained the appeals process, how death penalty cases automatically move to higher courts, how years might pass before execution. The families nodded, resigned to the wait. Justice had been delivered, but its execution would be slow. The appeals began almost immediately. Oregon law mandated automatic review of death sentences by the state Supreme Court. The defense attorney filed paperwork challenging the conviction on multiple grounds, alleged procedural errors, questions of jury instruction, and renewed arguments about Ackerman's mental competency. The years that followed became a legal marathon. Briefs were filed, oral arguments scheduled, and decisions delayed. The families watched from a distance, their lives moving forward even as the case remained frozen in appellate limbo. Ellis's daughter, married, had children, built a career. Michelle's relatives aged, some passing away before the case reached its final resolution. Ackerman sat in his cell, disconnected from the process. Prison psychologists continued evaluating him, documenting his deteriorating mental state. He spoke in fragments, referencing conspiracies and threats that did not exist. His delusions deepened, his grasp on reality loosening with each passing year. The defense attorney focused on competency. If Ackerman could not understand the appeals process, could not assist in his own defense, then executing him would violate constitutional protections. Psychiatric reports supported this argument. Ackerman's mental state had declined significantly since the trial. The prosecutor countered that competency at the time of the crime was what mattered. Ackerman had known right from wrong when he murdered Ellis, Abdil, and George. His subsequent deterioration did not erase that culpability. The Oregon Supreme Court reviewed transcripts, evidence, and psychiatric evaluations. Lower court decisions were scrutinized. Precedents were analyzed. The justices deliberated behind closed doors, weighing legal standards against human complexity. Meanwhile, the community's attention drifted. New tragedies emerged. New headlines dominated. Roxy and Michelle became memories rather than immediate wounds. Only advocacy groups and the families kept their names alive, speaking at events, pushing for hate crime legislation, ensuring the story was not forgotten. The legal system ground forward, slow and inexorable. On March 15th, the Oregon Supreme Court issued its ruling. After years of review, the death sentence was upheld. The court found no procedural errors, no constitutional violations, no grounds for reversal. Ackerman's conviction and sentence would stand. The decision was reported briefly in local newspapers. The families received notification from the prosecutor's office. Ellis's daughter felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Nearly a decade had passed since her mother's murder. The legal process had consumed years of emotional energy. Now, finally, the highest court had affirmed what the jury decided. But public reaction was muted. Time had dulled the immediate outrage. Some community members still supported the death penalty, viewing it as appropriate justice for such calculated violence. Others questioned its value, pointing to the years spent in appeals, the cost to taxpayers, the moral ambiguity of state-sanctioned execution. Advocacy groups released statements. Some celebrated the decision as recognition of bias-motivated violence. Others lamented that Oregon law still did not formally classify such crimes as hate crimes, leaving a gap in legal protections for marginalized communities. Acrement, informed of the ruling, showed little reaction. Prison records noted his increasing detachment. He spent most days in isolation, speaking rarely, eating minimally. Guards described him as a shell, physically present but mentally elsewhere. The defense attorney filed additional motions, this time focusing exclusively on mental competency. New evaluations were ordered. Doctors observed Acrement over months, documenting his paranoid delusions, his inability to engage meaningfully with reality, his complete disinterest in his own fate. The findings were troubling. Acrement no longer understood why he was imprisoned, what the appeals process meant, or what execution entailed. The legal questions shifted. Could the state execute someone who no longer comprehended the punishment? The appeals continued, now on different grounds. The families braced for more waiting, more hearings, more years in limbo. By the time the competency hearing arrived, more than 15 years had passed since the murders. The courtroom felt different this time, smaller, quieter, less public. The media had moved on. Only a handful of reporters attended. The families came, older now, their grief transformed into something quieter but no less present. The defense attorney presented his case methodically. He called prison psychologists who testified to Acrement's delusional state. One doctor described conversations where Acrement insisted he was being monitored by satellites, that his food was poisoned, that guards were part of a conspiracy. Another noted his inability to recall basic facts about his case, his victims, even his own crimes. Video footage from prison interviews was shown. Acrement sat hunched, mumbling incoherently, his eyes unfocused. When asked about the murders, he responded with nonsensical fragments. When asked about his appeal, he stared blankly. The man on screen bore little resemblance to the one who had confessed years earlier. The prosecutor did not dispute the evidence of Acrement's deterioration, but he argued that competency for execution was a narrow legal standard. The question was not whether Acrement was mentally healthy, but whether he understood the connection between his crimes and his punishment. Even in his delusional state, some awareness remained. The judge reviewed the psychiatric reports, the video evidence, the legal precedents. The decision was difficult, balancing justice for the victims against constitutional protections for the mentally ill. After deliberation, he ruled Acrement was not competent to be executed. His sentence was reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom absorbed the decision in silence. Ellis's daughter felt a strange sense of closure. The death penalty had been removed, but Acrement would never leave prison. Justice had shifted shape, but it remained. Outside, the few gathered reporters asked for reactions. No one spoke. The years that followed were quiet. Acrement remained in Oregon State Penitentiary, housed in a special unit for inmates requiring psychiatric care. He rarely interacted with others. Guards delivered meals to his cell. Doctors monitored his medication. He existed in a liminal space, alive but disconnected, sentenced but not executed. Prison records documented his decline. By his final years, he spoke rarely, and when he did, his words made little sense. He referenced events that had never occurred, people who did not exist, threats that were imaginary. His delusions had consumed whatever remained of his coherent self. Advocacy groups occasionally referenced his case when discussing hate crimes, mental illness, and the death penalty. His name appeared in academic papers analyzing bias-motivated violence. But in Medford, he was no longer a central figure. The town had moved on, though it had not forgotten. Ellis's daughter visited her mother's grave regularly. She brought flowers, spoke quietly, updated her on family news. Michelle's relatives did the same. The losses remained, but life had continued around them. Children had been born, careers had flourished, new relationships had formed. Grief had not disappeared, it had simply integrated into the fabric of daily existence. The Lambda Community Center, opened in their honor, served the LGBTQ+ community for over a decade. It hosted events, provided resources, offered a safe space for people who had felt invisible. The center became a symbol of resilience, proof that from tragedy could emerge something life-affirming. But funding challenges and shifting community needs eventually led to its closure. The building was repurposed, the programs absorbed by other organizations. The physical space disappeared, but the legacy remained. Acrement's story became a footnote in a larger narrative about justice, mental illness, and societal progress. He lived on in isolation, forgotten by most, remembered only when his name appeared in case law citations or historical retrospectives. October 26th arrived without ceremony. Oregon State Penitentiary issued a brief statement. Robert James Ackerman had died in custody of natural causes. He was in his 60s, having spent over 2 decades incarcerated. No family claimed his body. No funeral was held. His death was noted, recorded, and filed. The news reached Medford through a brief article in the local paper. Ellis's daughter read it over morning coffee. She felt no satisfaction, no relief, just a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter had finally closed. She called Michelle's relatives. They shared a moment of reflection, then moved on with their day. The detective, now retired, heard the news from a former colleague. He had followed the case through appeals and hearings, always from a distance. Ackerman's death felt anticlimactic, no dramatic execution, no final statement, just the natural end of a life spent in isolation. He thought about the investigation, the mother's phone call, the confession. He had done his job. Justice had been served, however, imperfectly. Prison records documented Ackerman's final years. Medical staff noted his complete detachment from reality. He had stopped eating regularly. He rarely left his cell. His body simply gave out, worn down by time, illness, and the cumulative weight of decades in confinement. The cause of death was listed as complications from chronic health conditions. No autopsy was performed. No investigation was warranted. The prosecutor, also retired, reflected on the case. When asked by a journalist writing a retrospective, he described the evidence, the trial, the penalty phase. He acknowledged the complexity of mental illness in criminal justice. He stood by the conviction but understood why the sentence had been reduced. Justice, he noted, was rarely simple. Advocacy groups issued brief statements. They used Ackerman's death as an opportunity to revisit discussions about hate crimes, mental health resources, and LGBTQ+ safety. His name appeared in press releases, then faded again. In the months following Ackerman's death, attention returned to what had endured: memory, advocacy, and community transformation. The Abdil Ellis Lambda Community Center, though closed, had left an indelible mark on the region. It had served as a gathering place during years when LGBTQ+ individuals had few safe spaces. It had hosted support groups, educational workshops, and cultural events. It had been for a decade a beacon. The center's founding had come swiftly after the murders. Community leaders, devastated by the loss and energized by grief, channeled their anguish into action. Fundraising began within weeks of the trial's conclusion. Donations poured in from Medford residents, from statewide advocacy groups, from individuals across the country who had heard the story and wanted to contribute something tangible. The building opened in Ashland, a neighboring town known for its progressive values. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds. Ellis's daughter spoke, her voice steady. She described her mother's belief in kindness, in building rather than destroying, in love as resistance. Michelle's family echoed those sentiments. They wanted the center to be a place of joy, not just mourning, a space where people could gather without fear, where identities could be celebrated rather than hidden. For years, the center thrived. It hosted pride events, provided counseling services, and offered resources for young people struggling with identity and acceptance. It became a second home for many, a place where they could be themselves without apology. The walls were covered with photographs, testimonials, and art created by community members. Roxy and Michelle's portraits hung near the entrance, a constant reminder of why the space existed. But by the late 2000s, financial challenges mounted, funding sources dried up, other organizations absorbed similar missions. In its final year, the center's board made the difficult decision to close, ensuring its programs would continue elsewhere. The center's closure did not erase its impact. Former members spoke at vigils and community events, sharing stories of transformation. One woman described how the center had given her the courage to come out to her family. A young man credited it with saving his life during a period of suicidal ideation. These testimonials became part of the legacy evidence that Roxy and Michelle's deaths had not been in vain. Ellis's daughter became a quiet advocate herself. She spoke occasionally at schools and community gatherings, not as a professional activist but as someone who had lived through loss and emerged with purpose. She emphasized the importance of visibility, of refusing to let fear dictate silence. She described her mother as ordinary, a businesswoman, a partner, a community member, and that ordinariness was the point. Roxy and Michelle had not been symbols. They had been people living their lives. Their murder was an attack on that simple right to exist. Michelle's relatives took similar paths. They supported LGBTQ+ youth organizations, contributed to scholarship funds, and attended memorials. They refused to let Michelle be remembered solely as a victim. She had been vibrant, funny, deeply engaged with the world. Her legacy was her life, not just her death. The center's decade-long existence reshaped local acceptance. Medford and Ashland both saw shifts in public attitudes during that period. More businesses displayed inclusive signage. More schools implemented anti-bullying programs focused on LGBTQ+ students. Political candidates began addressing equality in their platforms. The changes were incremental but real. Historians and journalists periodically revisited the case, framing it within broader discussions of hate crimes and legal reform. Oregon eventually passed stronger protections for victims of bias-motivated violence, though advocates noted gaps remain. The Abdil Ellis case became a reference point in those debates, an example of why legal recognition mattered. As the years accumulated, the story transformed. It moved from immediate tragedy to historical case study to enduring symbol. Media retrospectives appeared on anniversaries, each one revisiting the crime, the investigation, the trial, and the community's response. Documentaries included interviews with the detective, the prosecutor, and family members. Journalists examined the societal context, how the case reflected broader prejudices, how it catalyzed change, how it revealed the fragility of safety. But the most powerful remembrances were the simplest. Every December, a small group gathered at the site where the truck had been found. They placed candles in a circle, creating a ring of light against the winter darkness. They spoke Roxy and Michelle's names aloud, ensuring they were not reduced to statistics or symbols. They shared memories, some from people who had known the women personally, others from those who had been inspired by their story. Ellis's daughter attended every year. She brought her children, teaching them about their grandmother through these rituals. She wanted them to understand that justice was not just a legal verdict. It was also the refusal to forget, the commitment to honoring lives cut short, the determination to ensure such violence was named and opposed. Michelle's family did the same, creating their own traditions of remembrance. They planted trees, donated books to libraries, and supported causes aligned with Michelle's values. They transformed grief into generative action, finding purpose in perpetuating her legacy. The broader LGBTQ+ community claimed Roxy and Michelle as part of collective memory. Their photographs appeared at Pride events, accompanied by the lambda symbol the center had used. Speakers referenced their story when advocating for hate crime legislation, for workplace protections, for marriage equality. The murders had been an attempt to erase community, responded by amplifying, by refusing erasure, by insisting on visibility. Time does strange work on tragedy. It softens some edges while sharpening others. The visceral horror of December 1995 faded into historical fact, preserved in case files and news archives. But the emotional resonance persisted, carried forward by those who refused to let silence reclaim what had been briefly illuminated. Medford changed, not dramatically, not completely, but measurably. The town that had once seemed untouched by such violence learned it was not immune. Fear gave way to vigilance, then to solidarity. Residents who had never considered hate crimes found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about prejudice, both overt and subtle. The conversation was difficult, ongoing, incomplete. Ellis's daughter grew older, her mother's absence, a permanent presence. She thought often about the life her mother never got to live, the grandchildren she never met, the milestones she never celebrated. But she also thought about the love her mother had lived openly, the courage that choice required, the model it provided. Roxy had been herself, unapologetically, in a time and place where that carried risk. Her daughter honored that by living similarly authentic, visible, unafraid. Michelle's family held similar commitments. They spoke her name at gatherings. They shared stories about her humor, her kindness, her dedication to community. They refused to let her be defined solely by how she died. She had lived, that was what mattered. The legal system had done its work. Robert James Ackerman had been caught, prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned. He had confessed. He had been held accountable. Whether his sentence was sufficient remained a matter of debate, but the process had functioned. Justice, however imperfect, had been pursued. Yet the story's resolution was not in courtrooms or prison cells. It was in the candles lit each December, the names spoken into winter air, the community center that had thrived for a decade, the advocacy work that continued. Roxy and Michelle's deaths had revealed a wound. Their memory became part of the healing. The final image lingers, a circle of light and darkness, faces gathered, voices speaking names that refuse to fade. Justice convicted a killer, remembrance honored the lives. And in that remembrance, love proved more durable than hate. Some stories end. This one echoes,